Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by DissociaDID. It's Soren. I know, the makeup doesn't really match the person in the body, but it's okay. It's art, it's cute, it's cool, we like it. Besides, right before we left for our break, we did a makeup look on TikTok, and this was when Kaya and Mara were fusing. I was kind of in denial about it still, but we did like eye makeup like this, and it was like butterfly themed eye makeup, I guess you call it. And a lot of people were like, oh my god, we love it, we love it. So I've redone it with the pink hair. What do you think? Do you like it? Today we're going to be talking about fight or flight, and I bet some of you have only heard fight or flight. Surprise, there's more. There's actually like 5, or depending on who you look at and what resource you look at and what therapist you're listening to, maybe even more, but we're going to go over 5. Fight, flight, fawn, freeze and flop. These are our body's stress and trauma responses. Each of these is an adaptive, functional, short-term survival mechanism in response to perceived threats or danger. Fight, flight, fawn, freeze and flop are all defensive mechanisms that are hardwired right into our brain due to our sympathetic nervous system. And we can go over that and the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system in another video, if that's something you'd like to see. The limbic system is the area of the brain that's actually developed the least since we were animals, so it's very, very thrown back into our lizard brain, hardwired deep into how your body responds to perceived threats and danger. Immediate, involuntary, unintentional, the way your brain will immediately react in order to protect you. Because it is so hardwired into our limbic system, we share a lot of these responsibles with other animals in the animal kingdom, like rabbits, dogs, all sorts of stuff. When you hear flop, I bet the first thing you thought of was a rabbit, which obviously they freeze, and some of them flop. Goats do as well. You know those fainting goats? Just play dead. Any animals that play dead, we'll go over a lot of it, but you might be able to relate a certain thing and be like, hold on a minute, I know animals that do that same thing. It's because we're all hardwired a very similar way. It's a primitive adaptive mechanism. For people like us who have PTSD or CPTSD or DID, these trauma responses are even more highly ingrained. They're recurrent behaviors that can easily be triggered. Most people will be more susceptible to responding with 1 or 2 of these trauma responses, and that can often be linked back to attachment theory and your childhood. Originally, fight and flight were thought to be the only responses to stress, and that was focused mainly on the autonomic nervous system. Freeze, as a trauma response type, was later developed after observing rats in stressful situations. Before I go into too much detail, and I can make a much deeper, more in-depth video if you'd like us to, and remember, if you're a Patreon member, you can vote on what videos you want to see next and suggest them to us from just £1. You can view our Patreon here. If that's something you'd like, let us know. But for now, we're just going to stick to what they are and how they might affect you. It's important to remember that what I'm talking about now isn't just random reactions to behaviors or personality traits. This is when you have been pushed into a trauma response where you feel very threatened, or as though your life is in danger, or past trauma that you've experienced is being reactivated and making you feel the same way that you did then, as though your life is in danger, even if that might not be the case now. If you get triggered and you have PTSD, it's very likely that you'll be pushed into one of these responses. It can happen with other people too who don't have PTSD, but this isn't like average behavior. So for example, if you're just a naturally confident or outspoken person, that does not mean that you're in a fight trauma response. You can just have a confident, outgoing, sassy personality. That's different from being in a trauma response, and that can be in relation to any of these: fight, flight, fawn, freeze or flop. So let's start with the one that most people probably know off the top of their heads, and that's fight. The fight trauma response, some people call it snapping back really aggressively, being very fast to anger, extremely defensive. It can also look like always being on edge and expecting an attack, tense muscles, clenched jaws and fists, ready to go. It can be a temper that's very explosive and unpredictable. It can also be talking back to authority figures and challenging them in ways that might not be appropriate or expected. Using taunting, mocking, insulting, and shaming people as a response to perceived threats. A my way or the highway kind of view on life. If other people disagree with you or challenge you on something, you're very much a, I'm going to attack you, my way is the right way, and if you don't agree with that, you can get out of my life. It's a very aggressive way of looking at perceiving criticism. Other kinds of aggression, like yelling, raising your voice with not much provocation, slamming doors, screaming, throwing things at people or at walls. I vividly remember once setting a boundary with someone after I'd helped them out, and then they immediately were like, well, now I'm going to take advantage of you. And I said, you give me back the thing I just gave you. I'm not having that. And they responded by screaming at me that it was too late and throwing a controller at my head, which hit the wall behind me, and it came out of nowhere. And it was just because they felt challenged or like I was standing up to them. And it can be very split-second reactions like that. Whereas a healthier person who's not been pushed into a trauma response, somebody who's worked through their stuff and can communicate effectively and directly, would maybe say, I don't like that, or I'm not comfortable with that, or this is how that made me feel, and I'm confused by this change in reaction, or whatever, and express their emotions. Somebody who's been pushed into a fight response will immediately go to, not necessarily always violence, but aggression, tenseness, defensiveness. Because like I said with that example, while other people might feel calm and safe enough to not be pushed into a trauma response and be able to communicate and talk their way through their feelings, somebody who's been pushed into a fight response is feeling like they're threatened, and their brain may be considering that, especially if they do have previous trauma, push them straight into a, this feels like a life or death situation where I have to fight my way out of it. I am running in the savannah, I'm an animal running away from a predator. What am I gonna do? Am I gonna run? I'm gonna fight. Defensive, reactive, extremely reactive, often very fast. And that can also then push them into feeling like they need to protect themselves at any cost. When you come down from this trauma response, a lot of people often feel very remorseful or embarrassed, regretful of their behaviors, because you're not necessarily thinking clearly. Your brain is taking over your conscious thought, your lizard brain is telling you what to do and pumping. Your energy, your muscles, everything are full of endorphins that are preparing you to fight as if your life were in danger. Reasonable thought sometimes switches off, and then when you come back down out of that, a lot of the time you can be like, holy shit, what did I do? What have I done? Why have I done that? I feel terrible about it. That's not who I am. I would never want to make someone feel like that kind of thing. Some people don't feel like that. Other people do. Being pushed into a trauma response does not necessarily make you a bad person. That does not mean that your actions are acceptable or that you shouldn't face consequences for them or that you don't need to work on it. But it doesn't mean that inherently you as a person or you within your soul are bad or cruel or evil. It means that you have some trauma. You're very easily being pushed, or maybe not easily, depending on the situation, but you've been pushed into a trauma response, and that's something that you need to address and work through on your own so that you don't harm yourself and other people. But it does not mean that you as an individual are bad. Your behavior and your actions might be bad. You might have done things you're not proud of. That does not mean that there's no hope left, that you can't work on it, that you can't heal from it, and that you can't do better. Okay, let's have a look at the flight trauma response. The flight trauma response might look like you're always rushing to do things, you're always going, you feel like you can't stop, you're very tense, very go, 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 must do now. You might feel uncomfortable or panicked when you have to stay still. Your energy might be spent micromanaging situations or the people around you. You might have a bit of an avoidant personality and a habit of ending relationships very quickly with very little warning and literally running from your problems, and having a phobia of commitment. You feel threatened, you feel endangered, you feel like there's any chance of a threat to you or your safety, you want to run from it. You won't sit and stay and communicate and work through it. You're out the door. You'll cut them off, end the things, whatever you need to do, you're gone. Or just avoiding it. It doesn't have to be literally running away from something. It could be complete avoidance. You've got to make a decision that's really hard and you feel very stressed about it and you feel very triggered about it. You might just not make a decision. You'll run from the situation. You might feel very trapped very easily, even in situations where realistically you might not be. You may also be a chronic overachiever, always throwing yourself into situations where you can't stop. There's no time to think, you just have to go. There's no downtime for you, there's no calm, there's no sit and relax, because like in one of the other points I mentioned, you might feel very stressed and tense when you have to stay still. You have to always be doing something. It often presents as anxiety and panic attacks can be a trauma response too. It can also look like being intentionally or unintentionally distracted all the time. Or a lot of the time. People who experience the freeze trauma response may become nonverbal. You may hear of people who have experienced trauma who, when they become triggered, they cannot speak anymore. They go nonverbal. It's a freeze trauma response in some cases. There can be other reasons for going nonverbal. Autism, for example, it's not always going to be just this, but this is one reason that it can happen. You may feel completely numb, like life is pointless, there's no point to anything, you have very little real emotion left. You're very cut off from the things that you experience. Any emotional response with you is literally frozen and you don't experience it. You may dissociate from it. It can also be a point of shutdown, which can look like giving people silent treatment or complete avoidance of topics, people, subjects, situations, environments, hiding away from the world, literally shutting yourself in and off, away from people, away from the outside world and specific places, procrastinating and experiencing an inability to make even very small decisions. You are frozen, you cannot think, you cannot make a choice, you just freeze. Some people have likened it to like endless social media scrolling and binge watching things. You're frozen in the space that you're in and you cannot interact properly with the outside world. You just are frozen in the action that you're on right now and can't move away from it, can't stop. And if it's an easy repetitive action like scrolling, you just keep going because you're frozen. Experiencing confusion over what's real or unreal, dissociation, and it can be confused with depression. It may also look like giving up on things quickly. The fourth trauma response, Fawn, is actually when somebody moves closer to the experience of their trauma or abuse. They're trying to play safe or win over their abuser or the situation that's making them feel threatened, and they will try to act in the right way to try and make it stop. It can look like people pleasing, it can look like going along with other people's beliefs, opinions, decisions, taking on board their values as your own without thinking about what it means to you or what you want to do or your opinions and your wants and your desires and how you feel, because you're just trying to placate them. If you mirror them, if you get close to them, if you make them like you, then they're not going to want to attack you. That's the thought process that can happen when you're fawning. And a lot of the time, I mean, for us, fawn is has been one of our most common defense mechanisms when we experience trauma. And sometimes there is no thought. We just would do whatever we were told and people please to the maximum, no matter what discomfort that caused us or whether it went against our values or whether we were in pain or any thought for the future. It was just, don't hurt me anymore. Like me, please stop. And that's it. So sometimes that can be thoughts, sometimes it really is lizard brain completely takes over, your brain shuts down and you do whatever it takes to fawn to this person and what they want you to do and what they feel about the world, to make yourself a smaller target as possible, someone less threatening, someone less of a challenge, someone less different. You fit into the pack, you're less likely to be attacked. Can look like dissociating. On a low level, dissociating can be like spacing out, people call it zoning out. Higher levels of dissociation can be full-on dissociative disorders like derealization and depersonalization as well, so DPDR. And then obviously you go into PTSD, CPTSD, both have dissociation involved, DID, OSDD, all that kind of stuff. But those are full-on disorders, not just a trauma response, even though most of those ones that I spoke about come from trauma. It can be letting other people make decisions for you and not making choices or decisions on your own, needing permission to make your own decisions or choices. So for example, maybe you have threatened or re-traumatized, you're in a very stressed space and you feel like you need to be given permission to leave the room or go to the toilet or eat or something like that, avoiding any situations or discussions that could potentially lead to conflict. Fearing saying no, being overly polite and agreeable, being hyper aware of other people's needs, wants, desires, emotions while being ignorant to or repressing your own, and relying on other people to help solve your problems, looking to other people to tell you what to do, what's right or wrong. It can also lead to identity confusion when it's sustained for long periods of time. For example, this can happen in people who have CPTSD. If you don't know what CPTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. You spend so long fawning and pleasing everyone around you and submitting to them that you're left with little to no sense of who you actually are and what you want and what your personality is. It can feel almost impossible to figure out and reconnect with your own wants and desires and personality when it doesn't revolve around pleasing other people to stay safe and mirroring other people to ensure your safety. And then finally, last but not least, the FLOP, or some people call it faint trauma response. It's a lesser known response, but it is also a biologically determined response to acute stress as a defense mechanism. The FLOP response, again, some people call it faint. We're going to call it FLOP because it makes us think of bunnies, and that feels nicer. It's very similar to the freeze trauma response, but it may also include total bodily collapse, which can look like blacking out, fainting, collapsing, losing consciousness, seizures, losing control over your bodily functions, being completely disoriented, appearing very disengaged from everything happening around you and yourself, showing a lack of emotions, and complete and utter submission. Similar to how Fawn shows submission, but this is like final end of the road, complete submission. This can also cause catatonia or dissociative seizures or non-epileptic seizures like we have in people who have experienced extreme trauma and abuse. Some people who've experienced this trauma response or seen other people experiencing this trauma response can liken it to literally playing dead. Your body completely shuts down. So for example, with going catatonic, we have a whole video on what catatonia is if you'd like to watch it. Like I said, people might liken it to playing dead, but it is a completely unconscious and immediate reaction. It's involuntary. It's not somebody deciding like verbally in their head and thinking to themselves, what would be the safest thing for me to do in this situation? I will play dead. I mean, that can also be a trauma response, but that's a thought out one, a decision that you might make in a traumatic situation. That's just as valid and probably can also count. But in situations like passing out or going into a non-epileptic seizure or experiencing catatonia, your body and your brain, your sympathetic nervous system is making the decision for you. It's a reaction and not a conscious action. Rabbits do this, so hence the name FLOP. Rabbits do this when they feel threatened, and so do the goats that faint. Fainting goats, you may have seen them. They get shocked, they get surprised, they feel endangered, they literally go stiff and will faint. When you have PTSD or CPTSD, you might experience things like hyperarousal or hypoarousal, hypervigilance, depressive episodes regularly. And that can mean that you display any of these trauma responses pretty regularly too. And if you do have a history of prolonged trauma, like for example, you have CPTSD, these trauma responses can be kicked off in situations that are actually relatively unthreatening because your body is always prepared to re-experience those kind of traumas. It's hardwired to be hyper-aware, hypervigilant, hyper-aroused, and ready to protect you at any given moment. If you are in a situation that is objectively not a real threat or danger, but you're already stressed and the current situation reminds you of an experience where you were genuinely threatened in the past, this can also activate your sympathetic nervous system and push you into one of these trauma responses. Lower levels of severity, they're also called stress responses. And we can, again, go into detail about this, and we can go into polyvagal theory and all sorts of stuff like that if that is interesting to you. But I think we will leave this one here for now. I think this is a good place to stop, don't you? Like we mentioned before, we do have a Patreon and Patreon exclusives that includes things like outtakes and bloopers and funny moments. It includes things like videos that will never see the light of day publicly that we either weren't happy with, or by the time we were ready to upload it, the situation had changed. So it's sort of little insights into things that our system has experienced or what was going on in our system that will never be seen publicly. It is only exclusive for our patrons. And if you would like to suggest videos like, hey Soren, guys, everybody, we want to see a video on this, please make it for us, you can suggest that through our Patreon. And you can also vote on other people's suggestions to help us choose what you want to see as part of the DissociaDID project. And you can also get things like merch, including our hand-drawn art posters like this, for example. You can get clothes, hoodies, stickers, whatever you want, whatever you so desire. You can probably find it on our Patreon, which you can join from $1 a month or whatever the equivalent is in your country. And that is the best way to support us. And we are so grateful to everybody who's a Patreon member. We are also in a court case against somebody called Sergio Costa. And if you don't know the details about that and everything that he did to us, there is a playlist on our channel called What Happened to DissociaDID, which goes through everything, including screenshots of conversations that were had and the whole timeline of what went on in court up to now. And it is It has been 4 years since it started, and in order to afford the legal costs, we fundraise through Crowd Justice. So if you would like to support us or help us raise the money to be able to pay our lawyers to help us get justice for everything that we experience, you can donate to or share the link to Crowd Justice, which is crowdjustice.com/case/DissociaDID. And this money goes straight to our lawyers via Crowd Justice. It doesn't come to us, it goes straight. You pay Crowd Justice sends it straight to our lawyers, and they can only use it on the case against Sergio Costa. So we never see a penny of it, we can't use it for ourselves, it is sent straight over to our lawyers and handled completely by them and Crowd Justice. So if you would like to help us out, that would be amazing. Thank you so much to everybody who's donated and shared. It has made a huge difference. We would not be here without that support. We would not be at the stage that we are in proceedings without that support, and we will be forever grateful. Please like and subscribe and share and ring the bell in order to see other videos from us, and we hope to see you again soon. Lots of love, everybody. Bye.